Before fences scarred the hills, before engines broke the silence of the glens, there was a profession shaped by wind, stone and patience, a life sworn not to comfort, but to the land. This was the profession of a shepherd. Tonight, we're diving into what life was really like as a shepherd in the Scottish Highlands in the year 1745. Before roads carved the valleys, before the old ways began to fade, the Highlands were a world apart, and survival depended on skill, instinct and endurance. Feel the crook worn smooth in your palm. Feel the peat-cold wind cutting through your cloak. Hear the distant bleat of sheep drifting across the mist. Feel the tension in your chest when shadows move along the ridge, because out here, one mistake could cost your flock, or your life. If you enjoy immersive history like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Forget the quiet storybooks. You'll learn the rhythms of the land, the quiet hardships no songs speak of, and the truth behind a life lived at the mercy of weather, beasts and time. Congratulations, you've just woken up as a shepherd in the Highlands, 1745. The first drops of rain strike your face as you scramble up the steep rocky slope, and you know with absolute certainty that you have perhaps 20 minutes before this becomes a full Highland storm that could kill half your flock. The sheep are scattered across the high pasture some 200 yards above you, grazing near the cliffs where the grass grows sweetest but where they'll be most vulnerable when the winds arrive. Your dog, a black and white collie whose grandfather worked for your father, is already racing ahead of you, understanding without words what needs to be done. Your lungs burn from the climb and the thin air at this altitude, but you force yourself to move faster, your crook gripping the heather and rock as you haul yourself upward. You can see the storm rolling in from the west, a dark wall of cloud sweeping across the glen below, obscuring the opposite mountainside, moving toward you with the inexorable power that Highland storms possess. The wind is already rising, whipping your plaid around your shoulders, carrying the scent of rain and distant sea. The sheep, sensing the coming weather, are becoming restless, their bleating carrying clearly in the strange silence that precedes the storm's arrival. Some of them are moving in the right direction, down toward the valley, but others are stubbornly remaining near the cliff edge, reluctant to abandon the rich grass they've been enjoying all morning. Your dog reaches the flock and begins working immediately, circling wide to get behind the scattered sheep. Using the pattern of movement you've trained into every collie your family has owned for generations, the dog drops low, eyes fixed on the sheep with an intensity that compels them to move, to turn, to begin flowing in the direction you need them to go. You whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cuts through the rising wind, and the dog adjusts its position, pushing harder on one side to turn a group of stubborn ewes away from the dangerous ground near the cliff face. The rain is falling harder now, cold and stinging, driven by wind that's strengthening with every passing moment. Your woolen clothing is already soaked through, heavy with water, but you barely notice because you've lived your entire life in these mountains, and you're never truly dry from October through May. What matters now is getting the sheep down to lower ground, into the relative shelter of the stone-walled folds you've built over the years in strategic locations throughout your territory. The flock is beginning to move together now, responding to the dog's pressure and your whistled commands, flowing like water down the mountainside, following ancient sheep paths worn into the rock by centuries of hooves. You count them as they pass you, your eyes trained to recognize each animal, even in the growing gloom of the storm. 137 sheep in this particular group, which means you're missing 2. Your heart sinks because you know what this means. You know you'll have to go back up the mountain in the heart of the storm to find them, because each sheep represents wealth, represents food for your family, represents your responsibility to the laird who owns these lands and trusts you to maintain the flock that provides woolen meat for the estate and income from the wool merchants who travel up from the lowlands each summer. The main body of the flock is safely heading downward now, and your dog is keeping them moving at the right pace. fast enough to get them to shelter, but not so fast that they panic and scatter. You turn back up the mountain, leaning into the wind that's now strong enough to make walking difficult, scanning the rocks and heather for the missing sheep. The rain is a curtain now, limiting visibility to perhaps 50 feet, and the wind carries a roar like the sea crashing against cliffs. You know these mountains like you know your own hands, every rock and stream and hidden hollow, but the storm transforms the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. There, a flash of grey-white against the dark rocks, you spot one of the missing ewes. She's wedged into a narrow cleft, probably seeking shelter but now trapped by her own bulk and the panic that storms induce in sheep. You make your way carefully across the rain-slick rock, your feet finding purchase where anyone unused to these mountains would slip and fall. The ewe sees you coming and bleats desperately, her eyes rolling white with fear. You speak to her in Gaelic, the soft, soothing sounds you've used with sheep since you were a boy, the language that seems to calm them better than English ever could. You reach into the cleft and get your hands on the ew's thick wool, feeling the heat of her body beneath the soaked fleece. You pull steadily, firmly, working her free from the rocks that hold her. She struggles at first, but your voice and your hands calm her enough that she allows you to guide her out. Once she's free, she immediately tries to bolt, but you catch her and hold her for a moment, running your hands over her body to check for injuries. She seems unharmed, just frightened, and you release her to run down the mountain toward the rest of the flock. Your dog, who's been watching from below, immediately moves to intercept her and guide her in the right direction. One more sheep remains missing. You climb higher, into the worst of the storm now, calling out in case the sheep can hear you over the wind. The temperature is dropping rapidly, and you know that hypothermia is a real danger, not just for the sheep but for you as well. Your fingers are numb inside your wet gloves, and your face feels like it's being flayed by the wind-driven rain. But you continue searching because this is what you do. This is what your father did, and his father before him, and all the shepherds who have worked these mountains for as long as anyone can remember. You find the last sheep near the summit, a young ram who has somehow gotten himself tangled in a patch of brambles that grows in a sheltered hollow. He's struggling wildly, cutting himself on the thorns, making his situation worse with every movement. You approach carefully, speaking soothingly, and kneel beside him in the mud and thorns. Your hands, despite their numbness, work with practiced skill, untangling the thick wool from the brambles, pulling thorns from his fleece, checking him for injuries. He has several cuts, not serious, but they'll need attention once you get him down to the fold. You lift the ram, all 70 pounds of wet wool and muscle and fear, and settle him across your shoulders in the position you've carried sheep since you were strong enough to manage it. The weight is substantial, and the descent will be treacherous with this burden, but there's no other way. The ram struggles for a few moments, then seems to understand that you're helping him, and goes still. You begin the careful climb down, testing each foothold before trusting your weight to it, moving slowly because a fall now could kill both you and the ram. The descent takes nearly an hour, and by the time you reach the lower pastures where your dog has already guided the rest of the flock into one of the stone folds, you're exhausted and shaking from cold and exertion. You carry the ram into the fold and set him down with the others. The fold is a substantial structure, walls of stacked stone about 4 feet high, with a roof of turf and heather that provides some shelter from the worst of the weather. The sheep press together inside, their combined body heat creating a pocket of relative warmth despite the storm raging outside. You take a moment to examine the ram's cuts more carefully in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the stone walls. None of them are deep and they should heal without trouble, but you'll need to keep an eye on him over the next few days to make sure infection doesn't set in. Sheep are hardy creatures, evolved for life in harsh conditions, but they are also vulnerable to injury and disease, in ways that require constant vigilance from a shepherd who cares about his flock. Your dog sits at the entrance to the fold, soaked and exhausted but alert, ready to respond if any of the sheep try to leave the safety of the shelter. You kneel beside the dog and run your hand over its wet fur, speaking words of praise. The dog's tail wags slightly, and it leans into your touch for a moment before returning its attention to the flock. This dog is 3 years old, in the prime of working life, and it has proven itself invaluable time and again. You wonder sometimes what you would do without the dogs, how shepherds in ancient times managed their flocks before someone first bred and trained these intelligent, tireless workers. The storm continues for another 2 hours, the wind howling through the glen, the rain falling in sheets that turn the streams into torrents and make the mountainsides run with waterfalls that will vanish once the weather clears. You remain with the flock, watching for any signs of distress, counting and recounting to make sure all 137 sheep are present and accounted for. This is your responsibility, your burden, your purpose. These sheep are not just animals to you. They're your livelihood, your family's survival, your contribution to the larger community that depends on wool and meat to sustain itself through the harsh Highland winters. As the storm begins to ease, as the rain lightens and the wind drops from a roar to a steady push, you make your way back out into the weather. There are other groups of sheep scattered across your territory, other folds where you've gathered them for shelter, and you need to check on each one before darkness falls. Your territory covers perhaps 2,000 acres of mountain and glen, rough pasture land that can support sheep but little else, land that has been worked by shepherds for centuries, shaped by their labour into a pattern of folds and walls and paths that make the work possible. You walk through the rain, your dog at your side, moving from fold to fold, checking each group of sheep, looking for injuries or signs of illness, making sure the walls have held against the storm, doing the 1,000 small tasks that shepherding requires. The landscape around you is starkly beautiful, even in the grey light of the storm's tail. Mountains rise on all sides, their summits hidden in cloud, their slopes a patchwork of brown heather and grey rock, and the vivid green of the grass that grows wherever water collects. Burns rush down the mountainsides, their water peat-stained and cold as ice, flowing toward the river that cuts through the bottom of the glen. This is the landscape of your people, the highlands that have shaped your culture and your character for as long as anyone can remember. These mountains are harsh and unforgiving, demanding constant labour and vigilance. But they are also your home, and you cannot imagine living anywhere else. The lowlands, with their farms and towns and easier climate, might offer a more comfortable life, but they lack the fierce beauty of the highlands, the sense of being connected to something ancient and enduring, the pride that comes from thriving in a place that breaks weaker people. By the time you've checked all the folds and accounted for all your sheep, darkness is falling and the storm has passed, leaving behind a sky swept clean and brilliant with stars. The temperature is dropping rapidly as it always does on clear nights, and you know the mountains will be white with frost by morning. You make your way back toward your dwelling, following paths you could walk blindfolded, your dog trotting beside you with the tireless energy that collies seem to possess even after a full day of hard work. Your dwelling sits on the lower slopes of the mountain, positioned to give you a good view of most of your territory, while remaining protected from the worst of the weather by a ridge of rock behind it. The structure is traditional Highland design, what some call a black house, with walls of stacked stone, no mortar, gaps filled with turf and heather. The roof is thatch, thick layers of heather or straw or whatever materials are available, held down against the fierce Highland winds by ropes weighted with stones. There's no chimney. The smoke from your peat fire simply filters up through the thatch, which has the benefit of preserving the thatch material and keeping out insects. You push open the low wooden door and step into the interior, bending almost double to clear the doorframe. The inside is a single large room, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, divided by function rather than walls. At one end stands the hearth, a simple arrangement of flat stones with a peat fire burning constantly throughout the year. The smoke rises toward the roof, making the upper portions of the room hazy, but at floor level the air is clear enough. Your wife is at the hearth, stirring something in an iron pot that hangs from a chain above the fire. The smell of broth fills the room, mutton and barley and wild herbs, and your stomach reminds you that you haven't eaten since before dawn. The floor is hard-packed earth, covered in places with rushes that you gather from the valley bottom and replace several times a year. Along one wall runs a box bed, a wooden structure built into the wall with doors that can be closed to hold in warmth during winter nights. This is where you and your wife sleep. Your 3 children sleep in a similar but smaller box bed on the opposite wall. The eldest, a boy of 12, is already showing promise as a shepherd and spends many days with you on the mountains. Your daughters, aged 9 and 7, help their mother with the household work and are learning the skills they'll need as Highland women. Your son is still out somewhere on the lower slopes, checking the sheep you assigned him to watch today. At 12, he's old enough to take responsibility for some of the flock. Though you still oversee his work and make the important decisions, he has a good eye for sheep, can already recognize individual animals at a distance, understands the patterns of weather and grazing that govern the work of shepherding. In a few more years he'll be as skilled as you are, perhaps ready to take on a territory of his own if the laird is willing to divide the estate's grazing lands. Your wife ladles broth into wooden bowls, and you sit on a low stool near the fire, feeling the warmth slowly penetrate your soaked clothing and chilled body. She doesn't ask about your day. She knows what shepherding requires, knows that the storm would have sent you scrambling across the mountains to secure the flock. She comes from shepherding folk herself, her father and brothers all working flocks in neighbouring glens, and she grew up understanding the demands and dangers of the work. She moves efficiently in the smoky dimness, serving broth to your daughters who sit quietly on stools near the fire, cutting bannock bread from a flat oat cake she baked earlier on the hearthstone. The broth is rich and hot, mutton from a ram you slaughtered 3 weeks ago, the last of the meat from that animal now almost gone. Soon you'll need to slaughter another sheep, probably one of the older ewes who will not breed again. You maintain the flock carefully, balancing the number of animals against the carrying capacity of the land, culling the old and infirm, selecting the best rams for breeding, making decisions that will affect the flock's health and productivity for years to come. The laird trusts you to make these decisions, and your annual payment includes permission to keep a certain number of sheep for your own use, meat for your family, and wool that your wife spins and weaves into cloth. Your son returns just as you're finishing your broth, pushing through the door with a blast of cold air and the smell of rain and sheep. His face is flushed from exertion and weather, and his clothing is as soaked as yours. He reports that all the sheep in his section are safe, penned in their folds, no losses from the storm. You nod approval and he grins, proud of his success. Your wife serves him broth, and he settles onto a stool beside you, eating with the intense hunger of a growing boy who has spent the day working hard. After the meal, you strip off your soaked clothing and hang it near the fire to dry. Highland dress is practical for the work you do, a long linen shirt covered by a belted plaid, the great length of woolen tartan cloth that serves as kilt and cloak and blanket. The plaid is woven in the pattern of your clan, though here in the mountains such distinctions matter less than they do in the more populated areas. What matters is the quality of the wool and the weave, the ability of the cloth to shed water and retain warmth even when wet. Your wife wove this plaid herself, spending the long winter months at her loom, working wool from your own sheep into cloth that will last for years with proper care. You examine your body in the firelight, noting the new bruises from today's work, the scrapes on your hands and arms, the perpetual ache in your left knee from an old injury. Your body bears the marks of 30 years of shepherding, the scars and calluses and misshapen joints that come from a lifetime of hard physical labour in harsh conditions. You're 42 years old, which makes you old by Highland standards, though you feel strong enough still to handle the work that shepherding demands. You know shepherds who worked into their 60s and others who died young from accidents or illness, and you hope for somewhere in between, enough years to see your son established in his own right and your daughters married to good men. The evening passes quietly. Your wife sits at her spinning wheel, drawing out wool into thread with the practiced skill of decades of work. Your daughters sit beside her, carding raw wool, preparing it for spinning, learning the craft that will be essential to their adult lives. Your son mends a tear in his plaid with needle and thread, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. You sit on your stool, working on a new crook, shaping a length of hazelwood with your knife, forming the hook that will allow you to catch sheep when needed. The fire burns steadily, peat providing a slow, even heat that fills the dwelling with warmth and the distinctive earthy smell that you associate with home. Outside, the night is cold and clear, frost forming on the grass, stars brilliant in the mountain sky. You can hear, faintly, the bleating of sheep from the nearest fold, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. Your dog lies by the door, ready to respond if needed, but relaxed in the knowledge that the flock is secure for the night. This is the rhythm of your life, the pattern that repeats with small variations day after day, season after season, year after year. Before sleep, you step outside for a few minutes, your body having adjusted to warmth enough that the cold air feels shocking against your skin. You scan the mountains, looking for any signs of trouble, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere far off, a fox barks, and you make a mental note to check your traps tomorrow. Foxes are a constant threat to lambs and sometimes to adult sheep if they catch them vulnerable. The moon is rising now, nearly full, painting the landscape in shades of silver and black, making the mountains look like the dwelling place of the ancient spirits that your grandmother used to speak of when you were a child. You've lived your entire life in these mountains, and you expect to die here, to be buried in the small plot behind the old chapel down in the valley where your ancestors rest. The land is part of you in ways that people from other places might struggle to understand. You know every burn and crag, every place where the grass grows best, every shelter where sheep can survive a storm. You know how the weather moves through the glens, how to read the signs that predict coming storms or clear days, how to find your way in fog so thick you can barely see your own hands. This knowledge isn't something you learn from books or formal teaching. It's something that seeped into you through years of living here, working here, being shaped by this landscape as surely as wind and water shape the mountains themselves. You return inside and climb into the box bed beside your wife, pulling the doors closed to trap the warmth. The bed is stuffed with heather and bracken and covered with blankets of wool and deerskin. Your wife's body is warm beside you, familiar after 20 years of marriage. You lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of your sleeping children, the pop and settle of the peat fire, the wind beginning to rise again outside. Sleep comes quickly, as it always does after a day of hard physical labour, but you sleep lightly, some part of your mind always alert for sounds that might indicate trouble with the flock. You wake several times during the night, conditioned by years of shepherding to be aware of changes in the wind or unusual noises. Each time, you listen carefully, determining if investigation is needed, then settle back into sleep when you hear nothing concerning. This is normal, this broken sleep, this constant low-level vigilance. You haven't had an unbroken night's rest in 20 years, and you don't expect to until you're too old to work and some younger man takes over your territory. Before dawn, you rise and dress in the cold darkness, Your movements automatic from long habit. Your wife stirs but doesn't wake. She'll rise later to tend the fire and prepare breakfast for the children. Your son wakes when you move and begins dressing as well. There's much work to be done today, and daylight is precious in the mountains where weather can change in moments. You step outside into the grey pre-dawn, your breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The mountains are white with frost, and ice has formed on the water barrel outside your door. The sky is clear, promising good weather for at least the morning, though in the Highlands such promises are never certain. Your dog emerges from whatever shelter it found for the night and stretches, ready for work. The two of you set off toward the nearest fold, moving quickly through the frozen landscape, checking on the sheep that weathered the night. As you walk, the eastern sky begins to lighten. First grey, then pink and gold, and by the time you reach the fold, the sun is breaking over the mountain peaks, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. This is the moment you love most, this transition from darkness to light, this daily miracle of dawn in the mountains. The sheep emerge from the fold, moving out to graze, their breath steaming in the cold air, and you count them automatically, ensuring all are present and healthy. Another day begins, another revolution of the wheel that turns your life. You were born in this very dwelling, delivered by your grandmother in the depths of winter, while a storm howled outside and your father was out on the mountain securing the flock. Your mother told you later that she could hear the sheep bleating through the walls, could hear your father's voice calling to his dog, even as she laboured to bring you into the world. It seems fitting somehow that your first experience of life was accompanied by the sounds of shepherding, as if the work claimed you even before you took your first breath. Your childhood was spent following your father across the mountains, learning the craft that had sustained your family for generations beyond counting. Your earliest memory is of being perhaps 3 years old, riding on your father's shoulders as he climbed to a high pasture, watching the sheep move like clouds across the green slopes below. You remember thinking that your father was the tallest, strongest man in the world, that he knew everything worth knowing, that being a shepherd was the finest thing a person could be. By the time you were 5, you had your first real responsibility, watching a small group of sheep in the lower pastures while your father worked higher on the mountain. You remember the intense pride you felt when your father trusted you with this task, and the terrible fear when one of the sheep wandered off and you couldn't find it. You searched for what felt like hours, calling and calling until your father appeared and found the errant animal within minutes. He didn't scold you, just showed you the place where the sheep had been, taught you to look for the signs that indicated where an animal had passed. The bent grass and displaced stones that told a story if you knew how to read it. You learned the rhythm of the shepherd's year by living it. Spring, when the lambs were born and you spent endless days and nights watching the ewes, helping with difficult births, bottle-feeding orphaned lambs, marking the new arrivals with the estate's mark. You learned that lambing season is joyful and exhausting in equal measure, that sometimes you save a lamb that seems certain to die, and sometimes you lose one that seemed perfectly healthy. You learn that each lamb represents potential wealth, potential food, potential security for your family, and that losing one always hurts even though losses are inevitable in this harsh environment. Summer, when the sheep grazed the high pastures and you spent long days on the mountain tops, watching the flock, keeping them away from dangerous ground, guarding them from foxes and eagles and the occasional wildcat. You learn to love those summer days despite their hardships, the sense of freedom that came from being alone on the mountains with only sheep and dogs for company, the vast open sky above and the whole glen spread below, the feeling of being part of the landscape rather than merely moving through it. Autumn, when you began gathering the flock for the sales, when buyers came up from the lowlands to inspect the sheep and negotiate prices, when the laird's factor made his calculations and determined which animals would be kept for breeding and which would be sold. You learned the economics of shepherding, how the sale of wool and meat generated the income that paid your father's wage and provided for your family, how the laird depended on the flock's productivity to maintain his own wealth and status. Winter, the hardest season, when the mountains became brutal and unforgiving, when storms could last for days and the temperature could drop low enough to kill sheep and people alike. You learned to work in conditions that seemed impossible, to maintain the flock when every fibre of your being wanted to seek shelter, to push through exhaustion and cold and fear because the sheep depended on you and there was no one else to do the work. Your father taught you more than just the practical skills of shepherding. He taught you the language of sheep, how to read their behaviour and understand what they needed. He taught you the language of dogs, how to train and work with the collies that made shepherding possible in this terrain. He taught you the language of weather, how to predict storms from the colour of the sky and the behaviour of birds, how to tell the difference between a squall that would pass quickly and a system that would settle in for days. He taught you the language of the land itself, how to read the mountains and glens where the grass grew best, where the water collected, where the dangerous ground lurked hidden beneath innocent-looking vegetation. He taught you which plants were poisonous to sheep, which were medicinal, which were simply worthless. He taught you the names of every hill and burn and crag in Gaelic, the old names that carried stories and meanings from ages past. You learned that the mountains had a history, that every rock and stream had seen countless generations of shepherds and sheep, that you were part of a story that stretched back to the beginning of human habitation in these glens. Your education was entirely practical, learned through doing rather than through formal instruction. You never attended school, never learned to read or write beyond your name and a few essential words. Some lowlanders might consider you ignorant, but you possess knowledge that no school could teach, understanding that comes only from a lifetime of direct experience with land and animals and weather. You can look at a hillside and know exactly how many sheep it will support. You can look at a ewe and know within a few days when she will lamb. You can look at the sky and predict the weather more accurately than any sailor or farmer. When you were 12, your father began allowing you to make decisions about the flock, asking your opinion on which pastures to use, when to move the sheep, which animals showed promise for breeding. At 15, you were doing most of the physical work while your father, growing older and slower, supervised and advised. At 18, when your father's health began to fail in earnest, you took over the full responsibilities of shepherding while he watched from the dwelling, offering advice when you sought it, but trusting you to manage the flock as you saw fit. Your father died when you were 20, on a spring morning when the glen was filled with birdsong and new grass. He simply went to sleep and didn't wake, passing peacefully after a life of hard work and simple satisfactions. You and your mother and younger siblings washed his body and dressed him in his best clothing, the plaid he'd worn at his own father's funeral, and you carried him down to the chapel where the minister spoke words over him. He was buried beside his father and grandfather, in soil that was part of the land he'd worked all his life. After your father's death, you went to the laird and asked to continue as shepherd of this territory. The laird, who had known you since childhood, agreed readily enough. You were young but proven capable, and the continuity of having the same family work the same land for generations was valued in the Highlands. The laird set your wage at the same rate your father had received, and granted you the same rights to keep sheep of your own, to cut peat for your fire, to take what you needed from the land within reason. You married the following year to a woman you'd known since childhood, the daughter of the shepherd who worked the territory adjacent to yours. The match made sense in practical terms, two shepherding families joining together. But you also loved her, had cored her properly according to Highland custom, walking with her in the glen on summer evenings, seeking her father's permission before proposing. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the chapel with both families present, followed by a celebration in your dwelling with whiskey and music and dancing that lasted until dawn. Your wife moved into your dwelling and took over the household work your mother had been managing. Your mother remarried within the year to a widower from down the glen and moved to his dwelling, and your younger siblings went with her. You were left with the territory, the flock, the dwelling, and your new wife, ready to begin building your own family and your own history in these mountains. The early years of your marriage were challenging as you and your wife learned to work together, to understand each other's ways, to build the partnership that successful Highland marriage requires. She was strong-willed and opinionated, which you appreciated even when you disagreed with her judgments. She was also hard-working and skilled, keeping the household functioning smoothly, spinning and weaving wool, maintaining the vegetable patch where she grew kale and turnips and herbs, preserving food for winter, bearing and raising your children. Your son was born in your second year of marriage, a strong, healthy boy who cried lustily and fed well. Your wife recovered quickly from the birth, as Highland women tended to do, toughened by generations of living in harsh conditions. 2 years later came your first daughter, then 3 years after that the second daughter. Each birth was risky, as all births are, but your wife survived them all without serious complications, and all 3 children thrived despite the hardships of Highland life. You raised your children the way your father raised you, teaching them through example and experience, giving them responsibilities as soon as they were old enough to handle them. Your son began following you on the mountains at age 4, learning to walk the steep slopes, to recognize individual sheep, to understand the work that would one day be his. Your daughters began learning from their mother at the same age, though they also spent time on the mountains and developed their own understanding of sheep and dogs and weather. Now, at 42, you've been shepherding this territory for 22 years since your father's death, and you've been training for it since you could walk. The knowledge you possess didn't come from any single source or any conscious course of study. It accumulated gradually, layer upon layer, year upon year, until you became something more than just a man who works with sheep. You became a shepherd, in the deep sense of the word, someone whose identity is inseparable from the work, whose understanding of the world is shaped by the rhythms and demands of maintaining a flock in harsh mountain environment. Your dwelling, though simple, represents a significant investment of labour and resources by Highland standards. The stone walls took weeks to build, you and your father and several neighbours working together to gather and stack the stones, filling the gaps with turf, creating walls thick enough to provide insulation against the Highland weather. The roof is replaced every 5 to 7 years, requiring days of work gathering heather or straw, weaving it into bundles, laying it in overlapping layers, securing it against the wind. The door is made of split oak planks, heavy enough to hold against storms, fitted with a simple wooden latch that can be secured from inside. The interior furnishings are equally simple but functional. The box beds provide warmth and privacy, essential in a single-room dwelling shared by an entire family. The stools and tables are homemade, crafted during winter evenings when outside work is impossible. The cooking pot hanging over the fire is iron, purchased from a travelling merchant years ago, and maintained carefully because its replacement would be expensive. The spinning wheel and loom are your wife's treasures, tools of her trade just as your crook and dog are tools of yours, representing years of her labour and skill transformed into the cloth that keeps your family dressed and provides extra income. Your diet is simple and repetitive, consisting mainly of oatmeal, barley, kale, turnips and mutton, supplemented occasionally by fish from the streams, eggs from the few chickens your wife keeps, wild berries and herbs gathered from the mountainsides. Milk comes from the 2 cows you're allowed to keep, which graze the lower pastures and provide butter and cheese as well. Bread is a luxury, made from the barley you grow in a small field near the dwelling, ground at the mill down in the valley for a portion of the flour as the miller's fee. You eat breakfast before dawn, usually porridge or brose, oats mixed with hot water and perhaps a bit of butter if you have it. Midday you eat while working, carrying oat cakes and cheese in a leather bag, drinking from the burns when you're thirsty. Evening brings the main meal, a stew or broth when you have meat, kale and turnips and barley when you don't, always accompanied by oat cakes. It's not a varied diet, but it's adequate to fuel the hard physical labour your life requires. Clothing follows the traditional Highland pattern, practical garments suited to the work and weather. Your linen shirt is long and loose, comfortable for movement and absorbent for sweat. Over it goes your plaid, that versatile length of woolen tartan that serves a dozen purposes. Belted at the waist, it forms a kilt that leaves your legs free for climbing and walking. The upper portion can be draped over your shoulders as a cloak, wrapped around your body for warmth, pulled over your head in rain, or spread on the ground as a blanket when you need to sleep on the mountain. Your feet are often bare in summer, callous tough from years of walking rocky ground, but in winter you wear brogues, simple leather shoes without left or right designation, stuffed with grass for warmth and insulation. Your wife's clothing is similarly practical, a long linen shift covered by a woolen dress, with a plaid of her own that she wraps around her shoulders when outside. She goes barefoot within the dwelling but wears brogues for outside work. Your daughters dress like their mother, and your son dresses like you, all of you wearing variations on the same basic Highland garments that have served your people for generations. Hygiene is limited by the cold and the lack of private space for bathing. You wash your face and hands daily in cold water from the burn, using a rough cloth and occasionally a bit of soap made from mutton fat and wood ash. Full body washing happens rarely, perhaps once a month in summer when you can heat enough water over the fire, more rarely in winter when the cold makes such washing impractical. Your clothes are washed occasionally when weather permits, but mostly they're simply worn until they wear out, then replaced with new garments woven by your wife. The work is physically demanding and dangerous in ways that take their toll over time. You've broken bones from falls on the mountains, suffered infections from cuts and scrapes, endured the chronic pain of joints worn by years of climbing and carrying heavy loads. Many shepherds you've known have been killed by falls, by storms, by the occasional attack from a stag or wildcat, by simple exhaustion and exposure. You've been lucky to survive to your current age with all your limbs intact and your health reasonably good. The mental toll is perhaps less obvious, but equally real. The constant vigilance required, the worry about losing sheep to weather or predators or disease, the knowledge that your family's survival depends entirely on your ability to maintain the flock, the isolation of spending days alone on the mountains with only sheep and dogs for company. All of this creates a kind of pressure that never entirely lifts. You've known shepherds who developed strange behaviours from too much solitude, talking to themselves or their dogs as if the animals could respond with human speech, seeing patterns and meanings in clouds and rocks that others couldn't perceive. Your social world is limited but meaningful. You see your wife and children daily, of course, and you interact occasionally with the other shepherds who work neighbouring territories, meeting at boundary lines to discuss sheep that have wandered or coordinate responses to weather or predators. Several times a year you travel down to the valley for church services, for market days, for meetings called by the laird's factor to discuss estate business. These occasions provide contact with a wider world, news from other glens and from the lowlands, gossip and stories and information about events beyond your immediate experience. The laird himself you see rarely, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year when he tours his properties or when you're summoned to provide reports on the flock's condition. He's a distant figure, not unkind but separated from you by vast gulfs of wealth and status and experience. He lives in a stone house in the valley, with multiple rooms and glass windows and furniture brought up from Edinburgh, a life as different from yours as if he lived on another continent. yet your fates are intertwined. His wealth depends in part on the success of the flocks you manage, and your survival depends on his continued willingness to employ shepherds and maintain the estate. You pay no direct rent for your dwelling or the land you use, but you provide labour in lieu of payment, working for the laird when needed for tasks beyond shepherding. You're required to give several days each year to road maintenance, to harvesting the laird's crops, to whatever projects the factor determines are necessary. These obligations are frustrating when they take you away from your flock during busy seasons, but they're also understood as part of the bargain that allows you to live and work on the estate. Your clan identity is important, though not overwhelming in your daily life. You're a member of one of the Highland clans, connected by blood and tradition to hundreds of others who bear the same name and wear the same tartan pattern. In times of conflict, you would be expected to fight for your clan chief, to rally to the gathering place when the fiery cross is carried through the glen. But such times are rare in your experience, and mostly your clan identity is simply a fact of your existence, something that defines who you are in relation to the larger Highland world. The Highland culture you're part of has its own customs and traditions that shape your life in subtle ways. You speak Gaelic primarily, with only limited English learned from occasional contact with lowlanders. Your stories and songs are in Gaelic, telling of ancient heroes and battles and romances, passed down through oral tradition because few Highlanders can read or write. Your music comes from pipes and fiddles and voices raised in ancient melodies, played at gatherings and celebrations, maintaining links to a past that stretches back into myth and legend. Religion plays a role in your life, though perhaps a smaller one than ministers would prefer. You attend church when you can, listen to sermons you don't always understand, bow your head during prayers, and make a show of piety that seems expected. But your real faith is older and stranger than Christianity, a belief in the spirits of the land, in the power of certain places and certain days, in omens and signs that speak to those who know how to read them. Your grandmother taught you to leave offerings at certain stones, to avoid certain areas on certain days, to speak respectfully of the beings who inhabit the wild places. You don't speak of these beliefs to the minister, but they're as real to you as the sheep on the mountains. You've spent your entire life becoming what you are, and when you think about your identity, about who you are in the deepest sense, the answer is simple and profound. You're a shepherd. Not someone who does shepherding, not someone who happens to work with sheep, but a shepherd in the essential meaning of the word, someone whose entire existence is shaped by and devoted to the ancient work of managing flocks in harsh terrain. This identity carries weight and meaning that outsiders might struggle to understand. In the Highlands, shepherding is not simply a job or an occupation. It's a calling, a way of life that demands total commitment and shapes every aspect of your existence. You don't stop being a shepherd when you return to your dwelling at night. You don't take days off or holidays from the responsibilities that come with managing a flock. The sheep are always there, always needing your attention, always depending on your vigilance and skill for their survival. You take pride in your work, though it's a quiet pride that doesn't require constant affirmation. You know you're good at what you do, that the flock under your care thrives despite the harsh conditions, that the laird trusts you because you've proven yourself reliable year after year. You've seen other shepherds fail, lose sheep to preventable accidents or poor decisions, and you've made certain not to make their mistakes. Your reputation in the glen is solid. When other shepherds speak of you, they speak with respect, acknowledging your skill and dedication. The relationship you have with your sheep is complex and difficult to articulate. You don't sentimentalize them as pets or companions. You're fully aware that they're livestock, resources, animals that will eventually be sold or slaughtered. You make practical decisions about them based on economic and management considerations, culling the weak and unproductive without excessive sentiment. And yet, you also care about them in ways that go beyond simple economics. You know many of them as individuals, recognize their personalities and quirks, feel satisfaction when they thrive and distress when they suffer. Your dogs occupy a different category in your mental hierarchy, closer to partners than servants. You depend on them completely for the work, and you've developed a relationship with your current collie that approaches the kind of understanding you have with your wife or children. The dog seems to read your intentions from the slightest gesture or sound, responds to your commands with intelligence and initiative, shows loyalty and dedication that humbles you sometimes. You talk to the dog constantly while working, not because you think it understands the words, but because the sound of your voice seems to help coordinate your efforts, to maintain the bond that makes your partnership effective. You understand your place in the social hierarchy clearly, without resentment but also without illusions. You're not at the bottom of Highland society. There are labourers and servants who work harder for less reward, who have less security and less respect. But you're also nowhere near the top. The laird and his family live in a different world, as do the factors and ministers and other educated men who run the administrative and spiritual apparatus of the estate. You exist in the middle, respected for your skill but limited by birth and lack of education, comfortable enough but always aware of your vulnerability to forces beyond your control. The knowledge that you possess, the accumulated wisdom of generations of shepherding in these mountains, is your real wealth. You can't read or write, can't calculate beyond simple addition and subtraction, have no formal education in any subject, and yet you possess understanding that no book could teach, expertise that comes only from years of direct experience. You can read the land like others read written pages, seeing stories in the placement of rocks and the flow of water, understanding the complex relationships between terrain and vegetation and animal behaviour. You think of yourself as part of a tradition that stretches back beyond memory, connecting you to all the shepherds who have worked these mountains throughout history. You do the same work your father did, and his father before him, and all the unknown ancestors who brought sheep to these glens when the world was younger. This sense of continuity is important to you, providing meaning and context for your labour. You're not just working for yourself or your family. You're maintaining something ancient and essential, keeping alive a way of life that has sustained your people for countless generations. Sometimes, on quiet evenings or during long days alone on the mountains, you reflect on the nature of your work and what it means. Shepherding is fundamentally about care, about taking responsibility for creatures that cannot care for themselves in the harsh environment they inhabit. It's about constant vigilance, about being willing to sacrifice your own comfort and safety for the well-being of the flock. It's about understanding natural systems and working within them rather than against them, knowing that you can't control the weather or the terrain, but you can learn to work with these forces rather than being overwhelmed by them. You wonder sometimes what your life would have been if you'd been born to different parents in a different place. Would you have been happier as a craftsman in a town, or a farmer in the fertile lowlands, or a merchant travelling between cities? But these thoughts are idle speculation. You are what you are, shaped by circumstances you didn't choose but have learned to embrace. You cannot imagine doing anything other than shepherding, cannot picture yourself living anywhere other than these mountains. This is not resignation or lack of ambition. It's simply recognition of the deep truth that some people are meant for certain work, that your nature and your occupation are aligned in ways that make separation impossible. Shepherding is among the oldest human occupations, older than farming, older than metalworking, perhaps older than language itself. Archaeological evidence from across the world shows that humans have been keeping sheep for at least 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, when the first domestication of animals began. The first shepherds, in lands far to the south and east of Scotland, learned to manage wild sheep selecting the most docile animals for breeding, gradually creating the domestic breeds that spread across the ancient world. The sheep that graze your Highland pastures are descended from breeds brought to Britain thousands of years ago, mixed with native wild sheep that once roamed these mountains. They've been shaped by centuries of selective breeding for characteristics that suit Highland conditions: hardiness, ability to survive on sparse vegetation, tolerance for wet and cold, strong maternal instincts that help lambs survive harsh springs. The result is an animal uniquely adapted to this environment, able to thrive where other livestock would perish. Shepherding came to Scotland with the first human inhabitants of these islands, people who crossed from the continent when sea levels were lower and Britain was connected to Europe. These early shepherds left almost no written records, but they left stone monuments and burial sites that speak to their presence. The standing stones scattered across the Highlands often mark places of importance to ancient shepherds, gathering places or boundaries or sites of ritual significance. You've seen these stones yourself, weathered monoliths rising from the heather, and you feel a connection to the people who raised them, separated from you by thousands of years, but linked by the common work of managing flocks. The Romans, when they invaded Britain, encountered sophisticated shepherding cultures in both the Highlands and Lowlands. They wrote accounts of British wool, noting its quality and value, establishing trade relationships that brought Highland wool to markets throughout the Roman Empire. Some historians believe that the Roman demand for wool helped establish large-scale shepherding in Scotland, encouraging the development of extensive grazing systems and larger flocks. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted nearly 400 years, and during that time Highland shepherds sold their wool to Roman merchants, participated in a trade network that stretched from Scotland to Rome to Egypt to Persia. After the Romans withdrew, shepherding continued but became more localised, tied to the clan system that developed in the Highlands. Clans controlled territory and the resources within it, including grazing lands and the flocks that used them. Shepherds became part of the clan structure, owing loyalty to the chief, providing wool and meat for the clan's needs, fighting in the chief's wars when required. This system created a close identification between shepherds and their land, a sense that the mountains and glens weren't just workplace, but home in the deepest sense, worth defending with life itself. Throughout the medieval period, Scottish wool became increasingly valuable in European markets. The great monasteries of Scotland established large flocks, using the wealth from wool sales to build their abbeys and support their religious communities. Melrose Abbey, Sweetheart Abbey, and others ran flocks numbering in the thousands, pioneering techniques of flock management and breeding that influenced shepherding practices throughout the country. The monks kept detailed records of their operations, and some of these records survive, providing insights into medieval shepherding that would otherwise be lost. The monks bred sheep for wool quality, developing breeds that produced finer fleeces suited for the textile industry that was emerging in the Low Countries. They established regular sales and long-term contracts with wool merchants, creating commercial relationships that persisted for decades. They experimented with different grazing strategies, with dietary supplements, with medical treatments for common sheep ailments. Much of what they learned filtered out to secular shepherds, improving practices throughout Scotland. Individual shepherds rarely achieved fame in the way that warriors or nobles did, but there are stories of remarkable shepherds passed down through generations. In the Borders, tales are told of shepherds who could manage flocks of 1,000 sheep with only a single dog, who knew every animal by sight and could detect illness or injury at a glance. In the Western Highlands, stories survive of shepherds who guided their flocks across the mountains in winter storms that should have killed everyone, who found paths through supposedly impassable terrain, who demonstrated such skill and endurance that their names became legendary. One such story, told in several glens including your own, concerns a shepherd named Domhnall More, Donald the Great, who lived perhaps 200 years ago. According to the tale, Domhnall managed a huge territory in the remote northwest Highlands, overseeing several thousand sheep spread across mountains and islands. He was said to possess almost supernatural ability with dogs, training collies that seemed to understand human speech, that could gather and sort sheep with minimal direction. Other shepherds would travel for days to purchase pups from Domhnall's dogs, believing they inherited their father's unusual intelligence. The story tells that one winter, the worst in living memory, Domhnall kept his entire flock alive through months of continuous storms and bitter cold. While shepherds in neighbouring glens lost half their sheep or more, Domhnall lost only a handful. He achieved this through constant work, moving his flock daily to find fresh grazing, breaking ice on frozen streams so they could drink, carrying feed up to the highest pastures where sheep were stranded by snow. For 3 months he barely slept, barely ate, barely rested, devoting himself entirely to keeping the flock alive. When spring finally came, Domhnall's success became known throughout the Highlands. The laird whose flock he'd saved rewarded him generously, and his reputation spread to the point where other lairds tried to hire him away, offering wages far above the normal rate. But Domhnall remained where he was, loyal to the land and the laird he'd always served. The story is told to illustrate the virtues of dedication and skill, to show what a truly great shepherd can achieve through knowledge and effort and refusal to surrender to circumstances. Whether Domhnall More actually existed, whether his achievements were as remarkable as the story claims, you cannot say for certain, but the story endures because it represents something true about shepherding, about what the work demands and what shepherds strive to become. You've told the story to your own son, just as your father told it to you, passing down the example of excellence that Domhnall represents. Shepherding has shaped Highland culture in profound ways that extend far beyond the simple keeping of sheep. The patterns of Highland life, the seasonal movements between low and high pastures, the communal work of gathering and shearing, the importance of dogs and the breeding of collies, the design of clothing and shelters suited for mountain work. All of these emerged from the demands and opportunities of shepherding. The Gaelic language contains hundreds of words related to sheep and shepherding, reflecting the central role of this work in Highland society. Highland poetry and song often feature shepherds and shepherding, using the work as metaphor for broader human experiences. Shepherds appear as romantic figures in songs about courtship, as symbols of freedom in songs about political resistance, as representations of steadfast loyalty in songs about clan pride. The reality of shepherding might be harsh and unglamorous, but in cultural imagination, shepherds embody virtues that Highlanders value: independence, connection to land, hardy endurance, skillful management of resources. The wool produced by Highland flocks has driven economic development throughout Scotland's history. The textile industry of the lowlands depends on Highland wool, and the wealth generated by this industry has funded everything from grand Edinburgh townhouses to investments in colonial enterprises. Highland shepherds, working in remote glens and islands, are connected through their wool to global markets, to traders and manufacturers and consumers in distant lands who will never see the mountains where the sheep graze. In other parts of the world, shepherding has followed different patterns, adapted to different environments and cultures. In the deserts of the Middle East, shepherds have developed techniques for managing flocks in arid conditions, using nomadic strategies that move sheep long distances to find sparse grazing. Mediterranean shepherds practice transhumance, moving flocks seasonally between mountain and lowland pastures, creating migration patterns that have persisted for thousands of years. In the mountains of Asia, shepherds work at altitudes that would kill lowland breeds, with sheep adapted to thin air and extreme cold. Each shepherding culture has developed its own techniques and tools and relationships with their animals. Spanish shepherds created the merino breed, sheep that produce exceptionally fine wool, which they protected jealously for centuries through laws that made exporting breeding stock a capital crime. English shepherds developed numerous regional breeds suited to their local conditions, from the mountain-hardy Swaledale to the lowland Leicester with its long, lustrous wool. Australian shepherds, working in vast stations measured in square miles rather than acres, develop systems of extensive grazing and mechanical handling that allow small numbers of men to manage enormous flocks. Yet for all these variations, certain fundamental aspects of shepherding remain consistent across cultures and centuries. The work always requires vigilance, the constant awareness of where the flock is and what it needs. It always involves close observation, the ability to recognize individual animals and detect signs of illness or distress. It always demands physical hardiness, the capacity to endure harsh weather and difficult terrain. And it always creates a particular relationship between shepherd and flock, a bond of responsibility and care that shapes the shepherd's entire identity. The Roman poet Virgil wrote pastoral poems celebrating the shepherd's life, presenting it as an ideal of simple virtue and contentment, close to nature and free from the corruption of cities. Later poets throughout Europe continued this tradition, creating an idealized vision of shepherding that bore little resemblance to the actual work, but that captured something true about the appeal of the pastoral life. You've never read these poems, know nothing of Virgil or the classical tradition, but you understand instinctively what these poets were trying to express. The sense that there's something fundamental and valuable about work that connects people directly to land and animals and natural cycles. The Bible is filled with shepherding imagery, using the work as metaphor for spiritual leadership and divine care. God is described as a shepherd who cares for his flock of believers, and religious leaders are called shepherds responsible for their congregations. Jesus is portrayed as the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep, and this image became central to Christian art and theology. In churches throughout Scotland, including the chapel in your glen, paintings and sculptures depict Christ as shepherd, staff in hand surrounded by sheep, embodying the ideal of selfless care that shepherding represents. These religious images resonate with you in ways that more abstract theological concepts do not. You understand what it means to lay down your life for the sheep, having risked death many times to save members of your flock. You understand the relationship between shepherd and sheep that the metaphor invokes, the combination of authority and care, power and responsibility. When the minister speaks of God as shepherd, you think of your own work and find the comparison meaningful in ways that connect your daily labour to larger spiritual truths. Shepherding has also played crucial roles in historical events throughout Scotland and beyond. Highland clans raised armies of shepherds to fight in the Jacobite risings, men who left their flocks to follow their chiefs into battle against government forces. These shepherd soldiers brought to warfare the same hardiness and endurance that served them in their work, fighting in conditions that would have broken lowland troops, marching across mountains that enemies considered impassable, demonstrating loyalty to their chiefs that sometimes exceeded loyalty to their own survival. The great agricultural changes sweeping through Scotland in recent decades, what some call improvements and others call clearances, are transforming shepherding in ways that worry many Highlanders. Lairds, influenced by lowland ideas about efficiency and profit, are experimenting with larger flocks and new breeds, sometimes removing small tenants to create consolidated estates run by hired shepherds managing huge numbers of sheep. You've heard stories from other glens of entire communities cleared away, families evicted from lands they've worked for generations, replaced by shepherds and their massive flocks of lowland breeds that supposedly produce more wool and meat. These changes haven't reached your glen yet, but you sense they're coming, that the traditional way of life you've known is under pressure from forces beyond your control or understanding. The laird has been visiting his estates more frequently, bringing men from Edinburgh who walk the land and make notes in books and talk about improvements and rationalisation. You don't know what will come of this, whether your position is secure or whether you'll be swept away like shepherds in other glens. But you try not to worry about things you cannot control, focusing instead on the work at hand and trusting that your skill and dedication will count for something when decisions are made. As you stand on your mountains, watching your flock graze the spring grass while your son works the dogs through exercises that will sharpen their skills, you think sometimes about continuity and change, about what endures and what passes away. You're part of a story that began thousands of years ago and that will continue long after you're gone. A story of humans and sheep and dogs working together in mountain landscapes, creating systems of management and care that allow all three species to thrive. Your son will be a shepherd, you're certain of that. He has the gift for the work, the patience and observational skill and physical toughness that shepherding requires. He'll take over your territory when you can no longer manage it, and he'll teach his own children just as you've taught him. The knowledge you carry, learned from your father who learned from his father, will pass forward through another generation, adapted slightly to changing circumstances but fundamentally unchanged in its essentials. Your daughters will marry shepherds or men from shepherding families because that's the pattern in these glens. People marrying within their communities and occupations. They'll raise their children with the same understanding of sheep and mountains and weather that you've given them, and those children will carry forward the traditions and skills and stories that define Highland culture. In this way, you'll have descendants scattered across multiple glens, connected through blood and shared occupation, maintaining the network of relationships that holds Highland society together. The physical landscape you work shows evidence of generations of shepherding. The stone folds dotted across the mountains, some built by your father and grandfather, others so ancient that no one remembers who constructed them. The paths worn into the hillsides by centuries of hooves and feet, creating routes that you follow without conscious thought, because they represent the accumulated wisdom of countless shepherds finding the best way through difficult terrain. The place names in Gaelic that mark important features, cairns and burns and pastures, each name carrying information that helps orient shepherds and identify specific locations. You've added your own small contributions to this landscape, building and repairing folds, clearing rocks from pastures, finding and marking water sources, creating the infrastructure that makes shepherding possible. These contributions will outlast you, will be used by shepherds not yet born, connecting you forward in time just as the work of past shepherds connects backward. In 100 years, a shepherd will shelter his flock in a fold you built, will follow a path you helped maintain, will look at landscapes shaped by your labour without knowing your name but benefiting from your work. The breed of sheep you manage, developed through centuries of selective breeding, represents another form of legacy. These are Highland sheep, adapted specifically to this environment, capable of surviving conditions that would kill more delicate lowland breeds. You participate in this ongoing process of breed development every time you make decisions about which rams to use for breeding, which ewes to cull, which lambs show promise for future productivity. Your choices will influence the genetics of the flock for decades to come, will help determine whether these sheep continue to thrive in Highland conditions or gradually lose their adaptation to this harsh environment. The dogs you breed and train carry forward another genetic and cultural legacy. The collies that work these mountains are themselves products of centuries of selective breeding, chosen for intelligence and stamina, and the instinctive herding behaviours that make them invaluable to shepherds. You've trained many dogs over your career, and some of your best dogs have sired pups that work for shepherds throughout the region. These pups carry forward the training methods and working styles you've developed, spreading your influence across multiple flocks, even though you'll never meet the shepherds who work with descendants of your dogs. The stories you tell your children, the traditional tales of great shepherds and remarkable feats, the cautionary accounts of disasters and failures, the accumulated wisdom about weather and terrain and sheep behaviour, all of this represents cultural knowledge that must be transmitted orally because so few Highlanders can read or write. You are a link in the chain of oral tradition that stretches back to the beginning of human presence in these mountains, and you take seriously your responsibility to pass forward what you've received, to ensure that the knowledge doesn't die with your generation. Sometimes you worry that the world is changing in ways that will make your knowledge obsolete, that the improvements and rationalisation the Laird's Factor speak of will replace traditional shepherding with something fundamentally different. You've heard of shepherds in the lowlands who manage huge flocks using methods you don't fully understand, moving sheep in ways that seem more like driving cattle than shepherding in the Highland sense. You wonder if your son will spend his life working in the traditional way, or whether he'll have to adapt to new systems that value efficiency over the intimate knowledge of land and animals that you've spent a lifetime developing. But these worries are abstract, distant from the immediate reality of your work. Today, right now, you're a shepherd working in the Highland tradition, doing work that your ancestors would recognise and approve, maintaining standards of care and skill that have defined good shepherding for generations. The sheep are healthy, the flock is productive, your family is secure. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and you'll face them with the same determination and competence that you bring to every aspect of your work. As evening approaches and you prepare to gather the flock for the night, you feel the familiar satisfaction that comes from a day's work well done. The sheep are fed and safe, the territory is secure, your son has learned something new about managing the dogs. The mountains around you are bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way that you've come to love through a lifetime of living here. This is your place, your work, your life. You are a shepherd in the Scottish Highlands in the year 1745, heir to an ancient tradition, participant in a way of life that has sustained your people for countless generations. You gather your flock, your son and dogs working in practice coordination, moving the sheep toward their evening fold. The light fades, stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, and you walk home through the familiar landscape, tired but content, ready for whatever tomorrow brings. This is what it means to be a shepherd. This endless cycle of care and vigilance, this deep connection to land and animals and tradition. You wouldn't trade it for anything. The last lambing season. The wind cut across the Scottish Highlands like a blade, and Donald MacLeod pulled his wool coat tighter as he surveyed the flocks scattered across the hillside. At 73, this would be his final lambing season, though the sheep didn't know it yet. His border collie, Meg, sat at his heel, her eyes fixed on the ewes with the intensity that had made her indispensable these past 8 years. "Come by," Donald called softly, and Meg swept wide around the flock, bringing them closer together. The March winds were unpredictable, and he had learned 50 years ago that a scattered flock in a storm meant dead lambs by morning. The first ewe had been showing signs all afternoon, standing apart, pawing at the ground, that restless circling that spoke of labour beginning. Donald watched her waddle toward the stone shelter he'd built decades ago, the same shelter where he'd delivered hundreds of lambs over the years. By nightfall, he was kneeling in the straw beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he checked her progress. The lamb was coming backward, breech position. Without intervention, both mother and baby would likely die. Donald had done this so many times his hands moved with practiced certainty, guiding the tiny hooves, making room, easing the lamb into the world with patience born of experience. When the lamb finally slipped free, wet and gasping, Donald cleared its airways and rubbed it vigorously with straw. The ewe, exhausted, turned her head and gave that low, rumbling call that mothers make. Within minutes, the lamb was stumbling to its feet, searching for milk. Donald sat back on his heels, watching. This moment never got old. The miracle of new life against the odds, the ancient partnership between shepherd and sheep continuing as it had for millennia. His grandson, Jamie, would take over the flock after this season. The boy was eager, smart, good with the dogs. But Donald wondered if Jamie understood yet that shepherding wasn't just a job. It was a calling that required you to give up holidays, sleep through the night only in summer, and accept that your decisions meant life or death for the creatures in your care. The wind howled outside the shelter, but inside the lamb was nursing, its tiny tail wiggling with satisfaction. Donald smiled. Perhaps Jamie would learn, as Donald had, that some things were worth the sacrifice. The new shepherd. Maria stood in the pre-dawn darkness of her first day as a professional shepherd, her breath visible in the cold air of New Mexico's high desert. 6 months ago, she'd been an accountant in Albuquerque, drowning in spreadsheets and fluorescent lighting. Now she was responsible for 800 sheep on a ranch that stretched for miles. "You'll do fine," said Tom, the retiring shepherd who'd been training her for the past month. "Just remember, the sheep are smarter than people give them credit for, but they're also dumber than you'd ever believe. It's a paradox you'll understand eventually." Tom drove away in his pickup at sunrise, and Maria was alone with the flock and 2 dogs she still didn't completely trust. Or who didn't completely trust her. She'd read books, watched videos, completed her apprenticeship. But theory and practice were oceans apart. The first crisis came on day 3. She was moving the flock to fresh pasture when she noticed one ewe behaving strangely, separated from the others, her head lowered. Maria approached slowly and saw the problem. The ewe had gotten her head stuck in a section of old fence wire. Panic rose in Maria's chest. The ewe was thrashing, cutting herself deeper on the wire. Maria's hands shook as she tried to remember the training. Stay calm, move slowly, talk softly. She pulled wire cutters from her belt and began working, speaking in what she hoped was a soothing voice, though her heart hammered. The ewe struggled, nearly catching Maria in the face with a flailing hoof. "Easy, easy," Maria whispered, finally cutting through the last strand. The ewe bolted free, bleeding but alive, and rejoined the flock. Maria sat down hard on the ground, shaking. She'd done it. Not gracefully, not expertly, but she'd solved the problem. It was a small victory, but it was hers. Over the following weeks, the challenges multiplied. A coyote attack in the night that left her firing shots into the darkness, hoping the noise alone would be enough. A lamb born with its front legs folded wrong, requiring her to correct the position before delivery could proceed. A sudden hailstorm that sent her racing to get the flock to shelter, the dogs reading her urgency and working like they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. By summer, Maria moved through her days with growing confidence. She could read the flock's mood from 100 yards away. She knew which ewes were the troublemakers, which ones were the best mothers, which lambs would grow into strong breeding stock. Her hands had become tough and sure. She slept deeply now, exhausted but satisfied in a way her accounting job had never provided. One evening, as the sun set over the desert in brilliant oranges and purples, Maria watched her flock settle for the night. The dogs lay at her feet, finally accepting her as their partner. She pulled out her phone and took a photo, sending it to her former co-workers with a simple caption, "This is my office now." She couldn't imagine ever going back. The Wandering Shepherd. In the Pyrenees Mountains, between France and Spain, Jean-Baptiste followed the ancient paths his family had walked for generations. He was a transhumant shepherd, one of the few remaining who still practiced the traditional seasonal movement of flocks between mountain and valley pastures. The May morning was bright as he set out with 500 sheep, 3 donkeys loaded with supplies, and his 2 Great Pyrenees dogs, massive white guardians that would protect the flock from wolves and bears. The journey to the high summer pastures would take 6 days on foot, following routes that predated written history. The modern world pressed in from all sides. Tourists stopped their cars to take photos, causing traffic jams on narrow mountain roads. Environmentalists debated wolf reintroduction without consulting the shepherds who had faced the consequences. His children lived in cities now, visiting only occasionally, fascinated by his lifestyle but unwilling to adopt it themselves. On the 3rd day, the flock crossed a high pass where patches of snow still lingered. Jean-Baptiste walked at the rear, watching for stragglers, while the dogs ranged on the flanks. He'd made this journey every year since he was 12, walking beside his father. He knew every stream crossing, every meadow, every dangerous cliff edge where a careless sheep might fall. That night, camped in a stone shelter that had housed shepherds for centuries, Jean-Baptiste cooked his dinner over a small fire and listened to the bells around his sheep's necks. Different tones for different animals, a music he could read like language. All present, all safe. A young hiker appeared at the edge of his camp, asking in broken French if he could share the fire. Jean-Baptiste welcomed him, sharing bread and cheese. The young man was German, hiking the trails with a smartphone and GPS. "How do you know where to go?" the hiker asked. "There are no signs." Jean-Baptiste smiled. "The land is the sign. That rock formation means water ahead. The way the grass grows shows the prevailing winds. The sheep themselves know the path. They carry the memory of these journeys in their bones, passed from mothers to lambs." They talked long into the night, the old shepherd sharing stories of wolves encountered, storms survived, lambs born on the trail. The hiker listened with wonder, recording some of the stories on his phone. "This way of life is dying," the hiker said sadly. Jean-Baptiste looked out at his flock, peaceful under the stars. "Perhaps, but while I live, it lives, and these mountains remember. Long after I'm gone, these stones will hold the memory of countless feet, human and animal, walking these paths. That matters." When Jean-Baptiste reached the high pastures a few days later, he felt the satisfaction he always did, the completion of a journey, the continuation of a tradition. The sheep spread out across the alpine meadows, grazing on flowers and grasses found nowhere else. He would spend the summer here, mostly alone, watching the seasons change on the mountain's face. It was a hard life, increasingly anachronistic in the 21st century, but standing there, with the wind in his face and his flock before him, Jean-Baptiste felt connected to something larger than himself. A chain of shepherds reaching back to the beginning of human civilization. He was one link in that chain, and for now, that was enough. The emergency. Sarah's phone rang at 2 a.m, pulling her from deep sleep. The voice on the other end was her neighbour Bill, and it was tight with panic. "Sarah, I need help. Helen's in the hospital, heart attack. I'm with her now, but the flock, it's lambing season, and I've got at least 20 ewes ready to go. Can you—" "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Sarah said, already pulling on her jeans. She'd been shepherding her own small flock in Vermont for 5 years, but Bill's operation was 3 times the size of hers. She grabbed her lambing kit, whistled for her dog, and headed into the freezing February night. Bill's barn was chaos. Several ewes were in active labour, one lamb had been born but wasn't breathing, and others were calling with that urgent bleat that meant trouble. Sarah's training kicked in. First, the lamb. She cleared its airways, rubbed it hard with a towel, even breathed gently into its nose. Nothing. She tried again, more forcefully, and suddenly the lamb coughed, gasped, and let out a weak bleat. Alive. She moved to the next crisis and the next, her hands working by muscle memory while her mind stayed calm and focused. By dawn, she'd delivered 8 lambs, saved 2 that were coming wrong, and identified 3 ewes that would need veterinary attention later in the day. Bill called at 6 a.m. Helen was stable, but he needed to stay with her. Could Sarah manage for a few days? Those few days stretched into 2 weeks. Sarah called her own farm's helper to manage her flock and moved into Bill's spare room. She lived in the barn, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, sleeping in 3-hour chunks between births. Her own family protested. She had responsibilities at home, but Sarah couldn't abandon the animals. The work was relentless. Check every ewe every 2 hours, assist difficult births, make sure newborns were nursing, watch for signs of illness, treat infections, bottle feed orphaned lambs. The physical exhaustion was crushing. But there was something else too. A strange joy in being needed so completely, in having skills that made the difference between life and death. One night, as she warmed a chilled lamb by the wood stove, rubbing life back into its tiny body, she thought about why shepherds did this work. It certainly wasn't for money. The economics barely made sense. It wasn't for recognition. Most people had no idea how much work it entailed. It was something deeper, something about stewardship and care, about using your knowledge and strength to protect creatures that couldn't protect themselves. The lamb in her arms began to revive, its eyes opening, its legs starting to move. Sarah smiled, bone-tired but satisfied. This was why. When Bill finally returned home 2 weeks later, the worst of lambing season had passed. Nearly every ewe had delivered successfully, and the barn was full of healthy, bouncing lambs. Bill walked through his flock with tears in his eyes. "I can't thank you enough," he said. Sarah hugged him. "We take care of each other. That's what shepherds do." The teacher. In the hills of Wales, Rhys stood before a group of 20 students, all enrolled in his shepherding course. They came from different backgrounds, some from farming families, others complete beginners drawn to the idea of working with animals and land. At 45, Rhys had been shepherding for 30 years and teaching for 10. "Shepherding isn't romantic," he told them on the first day. "It's not about sitting on a hillside playing a flute while fluffy sheep graze peacefully. It's about being cold and wet for months at a time. It's about watching lambs die despite your best efforts. It's about making hard decisions and living with the consequences." The students looked uncertain. Good. Better they knew now what they were getting into. Over the next 3 months, Rhys taught them everything. How to read weather patterns and plan accordingly. How to recognise the early signs of disease. How to assist a difficult birth. How to work with dogs, developing the silent communication that made a good shepherd-dog team. How to shear, how to dock tails, how to trim hooves, the economics of sheep farming, the market forces, the paperwork and regulations. But more than the technical skills, Rhys tried to teach them the mindset. Shepherding required constant vigilance, an ability to notice when something was wrong, a sheep standing slightly apart from the flock, a change in appetite, a subtle limp. It required patience, because sheep moved at their own pace, not yours. It required humility, because nature always had the final say. One of his students, a young woman named Emma from London, struggled initially. She was afraid of the sheep, uncertain with the dogs, overwhelmed by the scope of knowledge required. Rhys worked with her patiently, remembering his own early days of incompetence and fear. Then came the day when Emma successfully delivered her first lamb, a difficult birth that required her to reach inside the ewe and reposition the lamb. Her face when that lamb took its first breath was transformed, lit with wonder and pride. "I did that," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I helped that happen." Rhys nodded. "You did. and now you understand what it means to be a shepherd. Not all his students would continue in the profession. The work was too hard, the pay too low, the lifestyle too demanding. But those who stayed would carry forward the knowledge and skills that connected them to shepherds across thousands of years. They would become the caretakers of the land, the guardians of the flocks, the keepers of ancient wisdom. As Rees watched his students work with the sheep, saw them beginning to develop that sixth sense that good shepherds had, he felt hopeful. The profession would survive, the knowledge would be passed on, the tradition would continue. And that, he thought, was his greatest accomplishment. Not the size of his flock or the quality of his wool, but the shepherds he'd helped create, who would in turn teach others, keeping the chain unbroken. The storm. High in the Australian Alps, Connor knew the storm was coming before the Weather Bureau issued warnings. He could feel it in his bones, see it in the way the kookaburras went quiet, smell it in the changing wind. His 1,500 merino sheep were scattered across the high country, and he had maybe 6 hours to get them to shelter. He saddled his horse, loaded his supplies, and called his 2 kelpies. The dogs understood the urgency, their usual playfulness replaced by focused intensity. Connor had been running sheep in these mountains for 20 years, following in his father's and grandfather's footsteps, and he'd seen what alpine storms could do to an exposed flock. The gather took hours. The sheep were spread across gullies and ridges, grazing the high summer pasture. Connor and his dogs worked in practice coordination, calling and whistling, pushing and guiding, gathering the scattered animals into a cohesive mob. The sky darkened as they worked, heavy clouds rolling in from the south. By the time they had the flock together and moving toward the timber shelter, the first drops were falling. Within minutes it was a deluge. Rain drove horizontally on fierce winds, and Connor could barely see 50 feet ahead. The temperature plummeted. This was the test that separated competent shepherds from excellent ones, keeping a frightened flock moving in the right direction through a storm, preventing them from scattering or stampeding, getting them to safety before hypothermia set in. Connor rode at the front, his dogs working the flanks, all of them soaked and freezing but focused on the task. One ewe went down, exhausted. Connor dismounted, lifted the animal across his saddle and kept moving. 2 more fell behind, and he sent one of the dogs back to keep them going. The storm intensified, hail now mixing with the rain, and Connor wondered if they would make it. Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw the tree line that marked the sheltered valley. He pushed harder, calling to the led sheep, urging them forward. The flock sensed safety ahead and picked up their pace, finally breaking into a run for the last 100 yards. Under the heavy timber, the worst of the storm couldn't reach them. Connor counted heads, all present. He checked each animal that had struggled, treating minor injuries, watching for signs of serious problems. The exhausted ewe he'd carried was already on her feet, reunited with her lamb. Connor made camp, built a small fire where it was safe to do so, and sat with his back against a tree, his dogs pressed against him for warmth. His clothes would take days to dry properly. He was bruised from hours in the saddle, and he knew he'd be sore for a week. But the flock was safe. This was the reality of shepherding that tourists and romantics never saw. The brutal physical demands, the life or death decisions made in crisis, the intimate knowledge of land and animals that meant the difference between success and disaster. It wasn't a job you could do halfway. It required total commitment, complete focus, and the willingness to put the flock's welfare before your own comfort. As the storm raged outside the shelter, Connor looked at his sheep, mostly settled now, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from meeting the challenge. This was his life's work. This was what he was born to do. Tomorrow he would assess any damage, check each animal more thoroughly, and plan the next move. But for now he was simply grateful. For his knowledge, his dogs, his horse, and the strength to do what needed doing when it mattered most. The legacy. Old Giuseppe sat on the stone wall outside his farmhouse in Tuscany, watching his great-grandson Marco work with the flock. At 91, Giuseppe could no longer manage the steep hillsides, but his eyes were still sharp, his mind still clear, and his knowledge still valuable. Marco was learning, as Giuseppe had learned from his own grandfather decades before. The boy had natural talent. He moved quietly around the sheep, reading their moods, anticipating their movements. But talent alone wasn't enough. Shepherding required experience, accumulated over years, passed down through generations. "The black-faced ewe," Giuseppe called out. "Watch her." Marco looked, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. "What about her?" "She's favouring her left front leg. Not much, but enough. Check her hoof tonight. Probably an abscess starting." Marco nodded, making a mental note. This was how knowledge transferred, through observation, through the old teaching the young, through patient repetition, until the lessons became instinct. Giuseppe's family had been shepherding these hills for 400 years. The flock book kept in the farmhouse recorded lineages going back to the 1600s. Giuseppe knew his sheep not just as individuals, but as part of living histories. This ewe was descended from the line that survived the harsh winter of 1956. That ram carried the genetics that produced the finest wool in the region. But the world was changing. Marco was the only one of Giuseppe's great-grandchildren interested in continuing the tradition. The others had moved to cities, pursuing careers in technology and finance and medicine. Good lives, important work, but none of them would carry forward this ancient knowledge. "No," Marco said, sitting beside Giuseppe as the sun began to set. "Why did you stay? You could have done anything." Giuseppe considered the question. "Your great-grandmother asked me the same thing when we were young. She wanted to move to Rome." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that someone had to remember. Someone had to carry forward what our ancestors learned. Every generation of shepherds adds to the knowledge. Which pastures are best in which seasons, which bloodlines are hardiest. How to read the weather in the colour of the evening sky. If everyone abandons the land, all that wisdom dies." "But times are different now," Marco said. "We have veterinarians, weather apps, genetic testing." "Yes," Giuseppe agreed, "and those things are valuable. But they don't replace the knowledge that comes from living with sheep, watching them every day, understanding them not as livestock but as creatures you're responsible for. Technology can help, but it can't substitute for care and attention and the kind of understanding that only comes from dedicating your life to something." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flock settle for the evening. The bells around the sheep's necks chimed softly in the breeze, the same sound Giuseppe had heard every evening of his life. "I'm glad you're staying," Giuseppe said finally. "Not for me. I'll be gone soon. But for them." He gestured at the sheep. "They need someone who cares, and the land needs someone who understands it. You'll learn things I never knew, and you'll pass them on to your children. That's how it works. That's how it survives." Marco nodded, watching his great-grandfather's weathered face in the golden light. He understood now what he was inheriting. Not just a flock of sheep and a piece of land, but a responsibility that stretched backward and forward through time, connecting him to countless generations of shepherds who had walked these same hills, faced these same challenges, and found meaning in the work. As darkness fell and they walked back to the farmhouse together, Giuseppe felt at peace. The legacy would continue, the tradition would survive, and somewhere in the future perhaps another old shepherd would sit with a young one and pass on the wisdom that could only be learned through living the life. The flock was settled, the day was done, and the ancient partnership between shepherd and sheep would endure for another generation.